Bonjour, Maigan Kijik Indishnakas, Maigan and Dudem, Saging and Donjiba. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Lorena Fontaine. My Anishinaabe name is Wolf Sky, and my family clan is Wolf, and I'm a member of the Saging First Nation in Manitoba. I'm also Indigenous Academic Lead at the University of Winnipeg. I'm also an Associate Professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies. So I'm going to begin my presentation talking a bit about my family. My father, the late Lawrence Edward Fontaine, was also from Saging, and in that community we speak Saulteaux, Ojibwe, or Anishinaabe. On my mother's side, my family are the Youngs and the Bignells. My mother is Doris Young from the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, and my maternal grandparents, who are in the middle of the 14 children on the screen, are the late John Young and the late Elizabeth Jane Young, but her maiden name is Bignell. And in this community, we speak the Swampy Cree dialect. And it is their legacy, really, my family's legacy, that has inspired me to do the work that I'm currently doing. My parents were punished as children for speaking our ancestral language in residential schools, and my grandparents were Cree language advocates. They loved and cherished our Cree identity immensely and wanted my family to continue to speak Cree because it's integral to our cultural identity. It is this legacy that has inspired me to work on Indigenous language rights for Indigenous peoples in Canada. And what I mean by language rights is the ability for us to protect and recognize the use of our languages and have this right recognized in law. And use means whatever is going to make our languages living languages and to protect them as living languages. So just a couple of examples would be if we were going to be serviced in health or any kind of social services, that workers would be able to speak in our ancestral languages and provide those services in our ancestral languages. Another example would be education, which I'm going to talk in a bit more depth in the webinar. But the ability, particularly for children, to have access to all levels of forms of education in Indigenous languages. And this would combine the right for all Indigenous peoples in Canada to establish and control their own educational systems and provide that education in our ancestral languages and to develop these systems in a way that's appropriate to provide our own ways of teaching and learning Indigenous languages. I'm going to go into statistics in a second, but I just want to say that the views that I'm presenting come from my legal background, my personal experience with my family as a community member, and also the work that I'm now currently doing with a grassroots organization in Manitoba to revitalize Indigenous languages with no funding. I'm going to go over statistics that come from Canadian Census, and these statistics come from 2016. But I'm going to provide a bit of commentary up front. I'm going to talk about what the statistics don't tell us. They don't give us the true state of Indigenous languages in Canada. There's varied situations in relation to one language to another, and these stats do not capture that varied situation. They do not capture the multiple dialects that we have across Canada. They don't capture the rating systems that we have, the syllabics that is used up in Nunavut, for example, as opposed to Roman orthography that's commonly used in the South. And they certainly don't capture the crisis shortage of Indigenous language teachers in Canada. Much of the data collected on Indigenous languages is not held by communities, and it's not accessible to our communities as well. I would just like to point out that a good source to look at analysis on this data comes from Mary Jane Norris, and I'm using one of her charts today in my presentation. So what we commonly see is the fact that we do have about 70 Indigenous languages in Canada. There's about 12 language families that comprise of those Indigenous languages. And then we also see the number of people being able to carry on a conversation but that is not adequately defined. We're not sure what it means to be able to carry on a conversation and how that helps us understand the state of Indigenous languages. If we look at international statistics, for example, UNESCO says that we have over 70 Indigenous languages in Canada. These numbers vary year to year, internationally and also in Canada. A few years ago, we were talking about over 50 Indigenous languages, and now Canadian stats say that we have over 70 Indigenous languages. What the stats do tell us is that we have relatively few Indigenous language speakers in Canada. What we do know is that the majority of our speakers live on reserve as opposed to off reserve. We also know that approximately the number of speakers that we do have are of an aging population. Up in Nunavut, those numbers vary quite differently. The numbers are more closely related to 60-50, 65 and over. We do find language speakers, and the ages of 0 to 14, we find 50% are able to speak in Indigenous languages. These numbers south of Nunavut vary significantly, where we have an aging population of language speakers. Again, the stats do not recognize that there are variations to these stats. For example, in the community of Pongassi in Northern Ontario, the majority of speakers are across the board in age. They have a high number of fluent speakers in that community. What a lot of the statistics do tell us is that all our languages in Canada, our Indigenous languages, are endangered. And you see in this pie chart, the varying degrees of Indigenous languages range from vulnerable to definitely endangered, severely endangered to critically endangered. Where I want to focus a bit of my talk this morning is on the term linguicide. Linguicide means killing a language. And I talk about capturing the state of Indigenous languages within this term. And I'm just going to read out a definition on linguicide. It occurs when state actors are involved in either intentionally destroying a language through laws and policies, such as the residential schools, or passively by simply letting a language die out as a result of a lack of support via unequal distribution of resources or power amongst language groups. Now, in the Canadian context, Indigenous children continue to learn English or French at the expense of their ancestral languages, and there is also inadequate resources. There's an inequality of distribution of resources for languages in Canada, and access to Aboriginal languages in education is rare, and when it's offered, communities struggle to survive to support these programs due to lack of adequate support and resources. And how this affects the health, this history of linguicide has occurred not only in the residential school system, in a past educational system. I argue that's also occurring in our current educational system, because what we're seeing is that we're imposing the dominant language as the medium of instruction in our current educational system. The harm this has caused by the legacy of the schools and now in the current dominant educational system is that our communities, our children do not have access to their ancestral languages in school. The legacy of the residential school has created a great deal of shame in our communities. And I don't think that we've had an opportunity to talk as a nation of Indigenous people about the harm that's done to our relationship to our Indigenous languages, but also the layer of shame that has resulted in harm in our relationships to one another. So I'm talking about relationships to grandchildren and grandparents, relationships to parents and children. The way that I like to describe it is like layers of shame that, if you can imagine what an onion looks like, the layers are much like that onion. And the inability to have access to our language means that we're not having access to our oral history that's passed on in our language. We don't have access to our plant and our land knowledge, and we certainly don't have access to the core aspect of our cultural identity, which is housed within our languages. So just that as a bit of a backdrop, as the state of Indigenous languages in Canada, I want to go to talk about the legislation that is being co-drafted right now with our national organizations. And oftentimes, the legislations that are being discussed in Canada are mixed up. We actually have two legislations being proposed in Canada. The first is coming from Senate, and that is called Bill S-212 or 212. This bill was proposed in 2009, initially by Senator Joyal, and it was reintroduced in 2015. And this bill has limitations. It's what I would call a recognition bill. It has limits because then it cannot require funding over and above what the federal government otherwise provides in funding for languages. And it only confirms existing powers of government to fund language in a way that it deems appropriate. It cannot force government to provide an increasing amount of funding, and it can't force government to provide support beyond what is already existing to Indigenous languages. The second piece of legislation that is being proposed by Heritage Canada is the one that there's been a lot of activity over the past couple years. There's been a number of engagement sessions. There's a paper that I co-authored with three other individuals. David Leach, who's a lawyer here in Canada, who's published a number of articles on Indigenous language rights and language rights. And he's also worked extensively with the AFN. There's Andrea Barron-Nicholas, who's a Maliseet from Tobique, who's published and has been a longtime activist for Indigenous language rights in Canada. And Fernand de Varenne, who is now the UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues. He's a renowned legal expert on minority language rights and has published over 200 papers in 30 languages worldwide. Now, we looked at what the government was proposing within this legislation, and we collectively looked at what would be beneficial within this legislation and a bit of the wording that could be contained in this legislation. So what we focused on in this paper is that parents should have the right to educate their children in the languages of their ancestors through language courses or immersion programs, and that these programs should be made available in both off-reserve and on-reserve at the expense of the federal government. And where this idea comes from is in the Constitution. The Constitution currently provides this right for French and English language. That's why we have immersion in English schools that kids are able to access for free in Canada. And all the literature points to immersion programs as being the most viable way of revitalizing an endangered language. So in this paper, we focused on Indigenous language rights to provide adequate support in resources for immersion programs. And up on the screen right now, you'll see the section in the Constitution that does recognize language rights for French and English. It's section 23. The wording, it's not the full wording within the section of the Constitution in the slide, but it does give you an idea of what the wording does look like. And what David Leach, Andrea Barron-Nicholas, and Fernand de Varenne looked at is section 35, which does recognize Aboriginal rights. And we are of the view that this section should recognize and affirm Aboriginal rights to Canada's First Peoples to transmit languages from one generation to the next. I have also had the opportunity to work with language teachers and language advocates in Manitoba. And what I found is that on the ground, the reality is if we're going to be looking at immersion programs, we are going to have to be working alongside with provincial and territorial governments, and that we need agreements in place that would allow support for language teachers and community activists to develop immersion programs in a way that is supportive. One example would be there is a critical need to certify Indigenous language teachers. Here in Manitoba, we don't have a classification for that. And I've been working with other language activists in Manitoba to discuss with the province of how that could happen. And what we've been told is unless there's government will to support this certification of Indigenous language teachers, that there will be no resources and no classification to help us in this area. Another part of the paper that we focused on was that we need a National Institute for Aboriginal Language Education. This is not a new idea. Indigenous people have been asking for this since the 1960s, and there has been no movement in this area, but we really need a national organization to disseminate and collect the material that's already been established to help immersion programs and distribute that material to communities that really need access to curriculum and resources to teach Indigenous languages. We also need a national organization to make sure that governments honor Indigenous language rights in Canada and that communities have a way to access somebody that they can talk to if they're having issues in this area. The last thing that I would just like to say is that much of the material that I've been talking about up to now is very much focused on the southern portion of the country. Aluki is going to be talking about concrete examples, health issues that are happening in Nunavut. The one national report that we have in Canada that does talk about Indigenous languages of Inuit, First Nations, and Métis was done in 2005. It's called Towards a New Beginning. It's an excellent report and resource for people to look at if they want to talk about Indigenous language rights in Canada and the things that we need to make our languages viable and living languages in Canada. And I would also like to say that there are a lot of experts that have been consulted on this legislation, but the real experts in our community are the language teachers, and those are the ones that we need to be looking at and talking to see how to make languages a living language within our communities again. And I would like to now pass over the presentation to Aluki. Miigwech.